Welcome back to another episode of The Road Chose Me. And today I'm going to go over a topic that everyone's always curious about, and that is different types of sleeping setups for overlanding trips. So I've said it a bunch of times, where you sleep is going to have a huge impact on your happiness when you're on the road. So what are your options? What are the pros and cons of each different option? Stick around, I'm going to get into them all right now. And before we get into the options, I want to say none of these options is inherently better than any of the others. There isn't a best, there isn't a worst. They're all just different. They all have pros and cons, and it really depends on where you're going and what you want to do, which one is going to suit your needs. And maybe one is really good for a certain trip, but they're not so great for a different trip. So don't go into this thinking that one is the ultimate, or marketing tells you, you have to buy this thing to be an overlander. That's not the case at all. Any of these options is perfectly workable, and I'd be happy to use any of them on my future trips. So keep that in mind as we go through the different options. So option number one for your sleeping setup on an overland trip is the humble ground tent. And I know, especially in recent years, marketing have really said, if you're in a ground tent, you're not an overlander. And I just want to come out and say that's complete nonsense. And anyone that says that clearly doesn't know what they're talking about. I slept every single night from Alaska to Argentina in a ground tent. I met plenty of other people doing the same thing. And even more than that, it's more common to go around the world on a motorbike than it is on four wheels. And everyone on a motorbike is in a ground tent. So that actually means there are more overlanders out there sleeping in ground tents than everything else combined. So that alone tells you how versatile and how good the ground tent is as an option. So don't let anyone tell you that ground tenting is not overlanding. That's just nonsense. So let's get into it. The pros and cons of a ground tent. I think one of the greatest pros is how inexpensive they are. So, you can pick up a cheap one for $50 or $100 and go all the way up to $500 or $600 if you really want to be in severe weather, or if you want to have a large one because you have a big family. And as well, it's independent of your vehicle. So you can have this in your regular car and go overlanding. You could have it on a motorbike, the same tent. If you decide to swap vehicles, you haven't invested money in your sleeping setup in the vehicle, and the ground tent is just independent of that. So I think that's a huge advantage. Another one is you get to set it up away from your vehicle. So there were plenty times in Latin America where I had to park the Jeep somewhere, maybe in like a locked security garage or something, but then down the road there was a hostel that had an amazing grassy area. And they were like, oh yeah, you can camp if you want for $1 or $2 a night, but I couldn't get the Jeep through the gate. So I couldn't bring the Jeep in there, and if I'd had my current one, it just would have been impossible. So I could leave the Jeep locked up in a secure parking garage and then walk back into the hostel with my tent and my stove and all of that stuff and camp there for a few nights. I did that many, many times. Even when I was out wild camping sometimes, the Jeep would be sort of nearer to a road, but I could walk away 100 yards and put the Jeep like on the other side of a fence or across a stream, or, set my tent up away from the road or the Jeep. And I had that versatility because you're not connected to your car, where your sleep can be independent. I think people forget that that's an advantage of a ground tent. Another great advantage, while I was on the road in the Andes, I did a lot of hiking. So I would load up my backpack with all of my camping gear, and I'd set out for 8 or 9 days on these hiking trips into the wilderness. And the great thing was, I already had the tent, I already had my sleeping bag, and I already had my sleeping mat, because that's what I was using every single night in the Jeep. I just then took them with me. So I didn't have to invest in a whole separate sleeping setup. And it's not like I had a sleeping setup in my vehicle and then duplicated it to then go hiking, because that would just be more weight and more stuff. I just used the one sleeping setup, whether I was on the move in the vehicle or whether I was on the move on foot. So remember, there are lots of advantages to a ground tent, and they do work really well. Of course, there are some downsides as well, so I'll go over those now. First and foremost, you have to set it up every single night. If you're going to stay in one place for a week, maybe not a big deal, but if you're on the move like I have been on my expeditions, it certainly is time consuming and it's one of those tasks that you just end up doing on autopilot. No doubt I got good at it and I didn't mind it from Alaska to Argentina, but it is certainly a chunk of time. As well as that, you are setting it up on the ground. So that means inevitably you're going to set it up on rocks from time to time, you're going to set it up on mud, it's going to rain and you'll wake up and realize that you're in a mud pit. All of that stuff can happen simply because you're on the ground. As well as that, it kind of makes wild camping a fraction bit harder, because not only do you have to find somewhere to get your vehicle sort of out of sight or off the road, you also have to find somewhere appropriate for the tent. At least a space physically big enough, hopefully kind of level, hopefully without too many rocks or mud. So it's a bit of a disadvantage that way, but I managed in Latin America, so I'm sure you can too. The other big disadvantage is you have to actually bring the tent and all of your sleeping equipment in the vehicle. And so that's just more interior space that you're taking up. It's more payload. And it means when it does get wet and muddy and all of that stuff, you're putting it away inside your car every day. Inevitably, the stuff inside is going to get wet and muddy. That's just the consequence of having this setup. Another downside for sure is that it doesn't really provide much hangout space. So as you can imagine, if it was raining right now, I'm kind of either sitting in the driver's seat of my little Jeep, or I bail into the tent and I'm kind of stuck in there for the night just reading a book, even if it's only 5 p.m. There were a few times I set up a tarp and I tried to make a little bit of an outdoor area, but it never really worked very well. So a smaller tent, especially like this, you don't get hangout space, but nothing would stop you buying a bigger one that you can actually stand up and walk around inside of. But certainly many thousands of people use a ground tent when they're exploring continents or the entire world, and it is a very valid option and you can totally make it work. Another super popular option, really growing lately, is sleeping inside the back of your vehicle. And when I designed this, I made that a part of my design so I could sleep in here. So I'll show you what it looks like in my vehicle. And I haven't done this actually since Africa, and you'll see why when you watch me do this. And I'll speed this up so you don't have to tolerate what I'm going through. So you can see I've just made the back of the Jeep flat for sleeping, and obviously I haven't done it for a while. It's pretty dirty in there. So what I would do now is grab the mattress sections and lay them all out. And if I move the two front seats forward, I actually have little flaps that lift up and they make the bed just long enough for me. I'm 6'2", it's kind of just long enough, but plenty wide enough even for two people. So sleeping in the back of the vehicle like this has definitely become very popular, especially in four-wheel drives and SUVs like this. For shorter trips, sure, you could just fold down the back seat, throw your thermarest in there or whatever, and that's probably good enough. What a lot of people do though on a longer trip is they build some sort of sleeping platform. So I'll throw some photos up here from my friend Joanne. She drove from Alaska to Argentina by herself in a Jeep just like this one. And herself, with I think with the help of her dad, she built a sleeping platform in the back of her Wrangler. It's essentially a piece of plywood with some footings, and you can see there's storage underneath it, which I think is absolutely genius. And she slept in that every single night when she made the drive by herself. Friends of mine drove Alaska to Argentina in the back of their 4Runner. Actually, two different groups of friends did that. Same idea, they built a sleeping platform, and for them it worked really well and they were very happy with it. So this is totally a valid option that a lot of people go with. Definitely an advantage is that you're inside the vehicle when you're asleep. So a lot of people really like that for safety and for security. You're away from people, you're away from the animals. If it's pouring rain or whatever, you can just climb into the driver's seat in the morning and start driving. You don't even have to put your feet out in the mud if you don't want to. Another big advantage of this is that it's relatively inexpensive and simple to make. So like I said, you could just fold the back seats down and then it costs nothing. Or if you're going on a longer trip, throw the back seat out, build some storage cabinets, build a bit of a platform. All of that might cost you a couple of $100 in plywood and a weekend. and you can go and try it out and use it. And then you'll probably figure out you want to make some improvements or some adjustments, and you can do that fairly inexpensively. And if you really hate it, it's not that hard to completely take it out and throw it away, or cut it into pieces and do a half and half solution, or all of the above. You really have a lot of flexibility with this option because it's cheap and it's fairly simple to do. I guess again, you don't really get a lot of hangout space. You can imagine when I'm sitting here on these cabinets, my head pretty quickly just hits the roof, and I don't even really have room to sit up if I want to change my t-shirt or anything like that. Different systems can be a little better. Obviously, if my platform was lower, that would change. And clearly, if you have a van with a really high roof, then that's the ultimate in terms of interior space. You can stand up and walk around and still be able to climb into your bed. Another big advantage of this setup is that it's a lot more stealth. So in a lot of places, if you cover the windows and sleep inside, nobody's even going to know that you're inside the vehicle. And so it makes it a lot easier if you want to sleep in a gas station parking lot or even on a residential street somewhere. You can probably get away with it for a night and not get into any trouble for, breaking the rules, or even you're just not going to have people come along and try and give you hassle the same way they might, if you had a pop-up roof or were sort of obviously camping. This is a lot more stealth. Another big advantage lots of people don't think about is that you're actually inside the vehicle when you're asleep. So if you want to charge some equipment, or you want to grab a book or even a bite to eat, all of that is inside your vehicle somewhere, and you can get to all of it. So whether it's pouring rain or it's pitch black or whatever, you don't have to go outside to get any of your stuff that you want, because you're inside with all of your stuff, which actually is really nice. And I know a ton of people like that because you just have everything with you. So it means camping is quite comfortable. I think a downside of doing this can be the heat and humidity. A lot of people wind up installing some sort of vent in the roof, something like you get on an RV where the little hatch opens and it maybe even has an integrated fan, just something to try and get the air moving, because especially with two people in a vehicle like this, it gets really hot and stuffy when the air doesn't move around. And condensation can be a big problem too in cold weather. It all just forms on the inside, and everything inside your vehicle is going to get damp and sticky. And eventually that's going to lead to mold and a whole bunch of other problems. So again, you want to try and do something to get some airflow, get some vent, get some movement happening so the air isn't so still and stagnant. All right, so those are your first two options in terms of where are you going to sleep when you're out overlanding. Those two are on the lower end cost-wise. They're also much simpler and easier. They don't really require any expensive modifications to your vehicle. I've got a couple more options to discuss, and I'll get to those in the second part of that video coming up next. So let me know if this has been helpful. Please fire away with any questions you have, and hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. There's plenty more content coming. Thanks again for watching. Maybe I'll bump into you on the road.